Welcome back to our channel. How would you feel if your lifelong invention was stolen by someone else, simply because they were younger and more fashionable? Bee Palmer was the original Shimmy Queen, the one who made America sway before Gilda Gray. But the entertainment industry has no compassion. When Ziegfeld found younger, prettier girls, they immediately stole her dance, launched the others into millionaires, and discarded the pioneer. Bee Palmer lived to be 83, spending more than half her life quietly in the shadows, watching the world forget who she once was. Fame not only has an expiration date, but sometimes it's snatched away right from your grasp. The year was 1894. Born into a working-class immigrant family in Chicago, Beatrice grew up in a society trapped in the stifling moral codes of the Victorian era. For women, the defining garment was the corset, a powerful metaphor for a society that demanded physical and emotional restraint. To move freely was to invite scandal. But Chicago had a hidden pulse. Far from the polite parlors, in the segregated, dimly lit clubs of the South Side, a new sound was brewing. Brought north by African American communities, this evolution of ragtime and blues was the incubator of early jazz. It was syncopated, unpredictable, and fiercely alive. Caught between these two worlds, Bee Palmer found her calling in the underground. Blessed with profound musicality, she began working the grueling local club circuit as a teenager. It was here she absorbed the intoxicating rhythms of this nascent art form and witnessed a cultural phenomenon taking shape. Historians agree that the dance we now know as the shimmy was deeply rooted in the vernacular dances of the Deep South. Characterized by a rapid vibrating motion of the shoulders and chest, while the lower body remained relatively still, it was a physical manifestation of a rhythm that could not be contained. Bee internalized this movement and translated it through her own artistic lens. When Bee performed, she would stand firmly at the microphone, letting a tremor travel up her spine until her shoulders blurred into a continuous shake in perfect time with the band. In an era where women were conditioned to move with mechanical precision, Bee vibrated with an unapologetic life force. By shaking her shoulders, she was symbolically throwing off the restrictive corset of Victorian morality. She reclaimed her physical autonomy with a wild, joyful abandon. The audiences in Chicago had never seen anything like it. Bee possessed a magnetic charisma that mesmerized the crowds. Men were captivated by her raw sensuality, while women were secretly thrilled by the audacity of her freedom. She wasn't just a novelty act. She was a fiercely talented artist capturing the restless spirit of a modern age. But local fame in smoky clubs was only the prologue. Having harnessed a rhythm too powerful to be contained in Chicago, Bee turned her sights eastward. She packed her bags, fueled by the fearless optimism of youth, completely unaware that she was walking into a finely tuned capitalist machine, a system meticulously designed to extract her brilliance, commodify her rebellion, and ultimately discard her soul. The journey from the smoky, subterranean clubs of Chicago to the blinding luminescence of New York City was far more than a geographical shift for Beatrice Palmer. It was an ascent into the very belly of the American entertainment machine. As the locomotive thundered eastward in the early months of 1918, carrying the young, ambitious performer towards Manhattan, the world outside her window was in a state of profound, anxious flux. Across the Atlantic, the Great War was grinding towards its devastating conclusion, casting a long, somber shadow over the globe. Yet, in stark contrast to the grief and austerity gripping Europe, New York City was a pressure cooker of frantic, restless energy. The city was practically vibrating with a desperate desire to forget, to celebrate, and to drown out the horrors of the modern age with unprecedented excess. It was a city primed for a revolution, waiting for a spark to ignite the powder keg of a new cultural era. B. Palmer, armed with an infectious rhythm and a rebellious spirit, was that very spark. The theatrical world B entered was ruled by one man, Florenz Ziegfeld. He was not merely a producer, he was the undisputed architect of American glamour, a man who possessed an uncanny, almost supernatural ability to dictate the tastes and desires of the nation. The Ziegfeld Follies, his crowning achievement, were the absolute pinnacle of show business. To be selected as a Ziegfeld girl was to be instantly elevated to the status of American royalty. However, the traditional Ziegfeld girl was a highly specific, carefully constructed commodity. She was statuesque, demure, and draped in unimaginably elaborate heavy costumes, often balancing massive chandeliers or towering arrays of ostrich feathers upon her head. She was designed to glide across the stage with an ethereal, untouchable grace. She was a beautiful, static monument to an older, more conservative ideal of femininity. She was meant to be looked at, admired from afar, but never to exhibit raw, untamed humanity. B. Palmer was the living, breathing antithesis of the Ziegfeld ideal. She was kinetic, unpredictable, and fiercely autonomous. She did not merely glide, she stomped, she shook, and she commanded the space around her with a visceral, grounding energy. When Ziegfeld first encountered B. Palmer, his legendary theatrical instincts must have been thrown into a state of severe conflict. On one hand, she defied every aesthetic rule he had established. On the other hand, the shrewd businessman within him could not deny the magnetic, almost dangerous pull she had on an audience. Ziegfeld recognized that the cultural tide was shifting. The public was growing weary of static beauty. They craved something visceral, something that mirrored the chaotic, accelerating tempo of the modern metropolis. And so, in a move that would permanently alter the trajectory of American pop culture, Ziegfeld brought the original Queen of the Shimmy to the stage, but he did not immediately place her in the main Follies. Instead, he deployed her in his more exclusive, provocative venue, the Ziegfeld Midnight Frolic. The Midnight Frolic was a vastly different beast from the grand, sprawling productions of the New Amsterdam Theater's main stage. Held on the theater's enclosed rooftop, the Frolic was an intimate, luxurious cabaret designed specifically for the elite of New York society. The audience consisted of Wall Street tycoons, powerful politicians, reigning socialites, and visiting European aristocrats. It was a playground for the wealthy, a place where the strict moral codes of the daylight hours were temporarily suspended under the glow of soft, amber lighting. The seating was arranged intimately around the performers, and the venue famously featured a glass walkway that allowed the wealthy patrons seated below to gaze up at the dancers. It was an environment dripping with privilege, exclusivity, and a thinly veiled undercurrent of voyeurism. It was into this lion's den of wealth and power that Beatrice Palmer stepped in 1918. When her name was announced, the chatter of the elite patrons likely died down to a curious murmur. The orchestra, handpicked and trained to navigate the complex syncopated rhythms of the new music she brought with her, struck up a driving, infectious jazz beat. The moment B. Palmer began to move, the atmosphere in the Midnight Frolic fractured. She stood center stage, her feet firmly planted, refusing to perform the delicate, sweeping waltzes the audience had grown accustomed to. Instead, as the tempo built, the familiar tremor began. It started in her core, an internal vibration that rapidly traveled upwards, turning her shoulders and chest into a blur of rhythmic, hypnotic motion. The shimmy had arrived in New York. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. The audience, composed of individuals who prided themselves on their stoic, aristocratic composure, were left absolutely, utterly speechless. The physical rebellion of her performance was entirely unprecedented on a mainstream stage. B was not just dancing. She was dismantling centuries of restrictive etiquette right before their eyes. The sheer velocity of her movement, the unapologetic joy and raw sensuality radiating from her, was deeply intoxicating. She was a woman completely in control of her own body, dictating the rhythm of the room, and the audience was completely spellbound. When the final note crashed, the midnight frolic erupted. The applause was deafening, a roaring wave of adulation that shattered the refined atmosphere of the rooftop cabaret. Overnight, the news of B. Palmer's performance swept through the city like wildfire. By the very next morning, the newspapers were locked in a frantic race to find the words to describe the phenomenon. The word shimmy was splashed across headlines from coast to coast. B. Palmer had not just debuted a dance, she had detonated a cultural bomb. Within weeks, B. Palmer became the most talked about, sought after, and highest paid female entertainer in the United States. She was elevated from a Chicago club performer to a national obsession. Her face graced the covers of magazines. Her style was obsessively copied by young women desperate to capture a fraction of her freedom. And the demand for tickets to see her perform reached feverish, unprecedented heights. Ziegfeld, ever the opportunist, proudly displayed his new star, bathing in the immense financial windfall her presence generated. However, with astronomical fame came an inevitable ferocious backlash. The cultural revolution B. Palmer was leading terrified the conservative establishment. To the guardians of public morality, the shimmy was not an artistic expression. It was a symptom of societal decay. Pulpit preachers delivered blistering sermons condemning the dance, warning that the violent shaking of the shoulders was a direct path to moral ruin. Civic leaders and politicians drafted ordinances attempting to ban the performance of the shimmy in public dance halls, arguing that it was fundamentally vulgar and a threat to the purity of American womanhood. But this intense wave of moral panic only served to pour gasoline on the fire of B's popularity. In the eyes of the youth, the condemnation of the older generation was the ultimate endorsement. The more the establishment tried to suppress the shimmy, the more desperately the public wanted to see it. B. Palmer became the living embodiment of rebellion. By simply moving her shoulders, she was encouraging an entire generation of women to question the restrictive corsets, the heavy skirts, and the stifling social expectations that had bound their mothers and grandmothers. She was the harbinger of the Roaring Twenties, a decade that would fundamentally redefine the role of women in society, and she was doing it through the sheer, unbridled power of physical expression. Yet to remember B. Palmer merely as a provocative dancer is to do a profound disservice to her immense historical significance. Beneath the visual spectacle of the shimmy lay a deep, complex, and highly sophisticated musical foundation. B. Palmer was a pioneer who played an absolutely critical role in the popularization of jazz music. In 1918, jazz was still largely viewed by the white mainstream establishment with deep suspicion and prejudice. It was considered race music, an underground phenomenon confined to the marginalized communities of New Orleans, Chicago, and New York. The complex syncopation, the improvisational brilliance and the raw emotional honesty of jazz were entirely foreign to the classical and ragtime sensibilities that dominated Broadway. B. Palmer served as the vital, necessary bridge between these two disparate worlds. She was the Trojan horse that smuggled the authentic sound of jazz into the heavily guarded fortresses of high society. Because of her immense popularity and undeniable star power, she was able to demand that the orchestras accompanying her play the music she felt in her soul. She refused the sanitized, watered-down arrangements that producers often forced upon performers. Instead, she actively sought out and collaborated with the most innovative, authentic jazz musicians of the era. Her influence in the musical sphere was staggering. She commanded the deep, abiding respect of male jazz titans, an achievement almost unheard of for a female performer in that intensely patriarchal era. She shared the stage and the recording studio with legends such as the cornetist Bix Beiderbecke, whose lyrical, inventive playing perfectly complemented her rhythmic drive. She collaborated extensively with the New Orleans Rhythm Kings, one of the most influential early jazz bands, helping to introduce their groundbreaking sound to a massive nationwide audience. When B. Palmer sang, she utilized her voice as an instrument, bending notes, playing with the phrasing, and locking into the groove with the precision of a master percussionist. She was not just dancing to the music, she was an integral part of the musical arrangement. She forced the Broadway elite to sit down, shut up, and truly listen to the breathtaking complexity of jazz. Without B. Palmer acting as a glamorous, undeniable conduit, it would have taken years, perhaps decades longer, for jazz to break through the racial and cultural barriers that sought to keep it hidden in the shadows. For a few blindingly bright years, B. Palmer stood at the absolute epicenter of the universe. She had wealth that most could scarcely comprehend, a level of fame that bordered on religious devotion, and the profound satisfaction of knowing she had irrevocably altered the cultural landscape of her country. She was a pioneer who had conquered the system on her own terms, a woman who had refused to conform and had ultimately forced the world to vibrate to her unique, syncopated rhythm. But as B basked in the warmth of the spotlight, a cold, calculating shadow was beginning to stretch across the boardrooms of the theatrical syndicates. The men who controlled the entertainment industry, the producers, the managers, the financiers, were watching the Shimmy craze with a mixture of intense greed and growing unease. They were thrilled by the millions of dollars pouring into their box offices. They loved the sold-out theaters, the frantic press coverage, and the sheer commercial velocity of the trend B. Palmer had ignited. But they despised the fact that they did not completely own it. B. Palmer was too talented, too fiercely independent, and too aware of her own indispensable value. She was a woman who dictated her own musical terms, who chose her own collaborators, and who refused to be treated as a mindless, obedient mannequin. In the capitalist machinery of the studio system, an independent woman is a terrifying liability. The industry bosses realized a fundamental, ruthless truth. The shimmy was a highly profitable commodity, but the woman who created it was a problem that needed to be managed. They needed a way to separate the art from the artist. They needed to extract the immense commercial value of the dance, package it into a more compliant, easily controlled vessel, and quietly, efficiently dispose of the original architect. As the applause thundered through the New Amsterdam Theater and B. Palmer took her triumphant bows, the men in the shadows began to drop the blueprints for her destruction. The golden era of the original Shimmy Queen was reaching its zenith, But the architecture of a devastating, deeply personal betrayal was already being laid brick by brick. The gilded cage was preparing to lock its doors, and the very system B. Palmer had enriched was preparing to steal her name, her legacy, and her life's work. The illusion of control is the most dangerous trap in show business. When an artist is standing center stage, blinded by the intensely hot glow of the limelight, listening to the deafening roar of thousands of adoring fans, it is incredibly easy to believe that they hold the power. It is easy to believe that the applause is a shield, that the box office receipts are a guarantee of longevity, and that the sheer force of their talent makes them untouchable. Beatrice Palmer, vibrating with the electric energy of the Shimmy, the undisputed queen of the Broadway nightlife, had every reason to believe she was untouchable. She was the architect of a cultural earthquake. She was the woman who had dragged the syncopated pulse of the underground into the grandest theaters in America. But the applause is never a shield. It is merely a distraction. While B was looking out at the audience, the real power was sitting in the dark, calculating, whispering, and preparing to tear her empire down to the studs. The downfall of a pioneer in the entertainment industry is rarely a sudden, dramatic explosion. It is almost always a slow, meticulous poisoning of their career, orchestrated by the very people employed to protect them, manage them, and profit from them. The capitalist machinery of the studio and theater syndicates of the late 1910s and early 1920s was not designed to foster individual genius. It was an industrial assembly line designed to manufacture reliable, compliant, and infinitely replicable commodities. B. Palmer was a genius, but she was fundamentally unreliable to the system because she possessed an independent mind. She dictated her own artistic terms. She chose the jazz musicians who accompanied her, and she understood the precise financial value of her own presence. In the boardrooms of New York, a woman who understands her own worth is not viewed as an asset. She is viewed as a severe liability. Florenz Ziegfeld, the mastermind behind the Follies and the Midnight Frolic, was a man who observed the shifting tides of culture with the cold, calculating eye of a predator. He had given B. Palmer her ultimate platform, and he had happily collected the staggering profits her performances generated. But Ziegfeld was a man who demanded absolute obedience from the women who graced his stages. He was accustomed to treating his performers as beautiful, interchangeable components of a larger, grander machine. B. Palmer, with her fierce autonomy and her deep, unyielding connection to the raw, unvarnished roots of jazz, was a constant source of friction. Ziegfeld realized that he loved the phenomenal wealth the Shimmy brought into his empire, but he had grown deeply resentful of the woman who actually owned the dance. The solution from a purely ruthless business perspective was devastatingly simple. The industry needed to separate the art from the artist. They needed to extract the cultural and financial value of the Shimmy, package it into a cleaner, more manageable vessel, and quietly dispose of the original creator. The search for B. Palmer's replacement did not take long. The system required a performer who possessed the physical capability to mimic the dance, but who lacked the artistic stubbornness and the underground edge that made B so difficult to control. They found their perfect candidate in a young, ambitious dancer named Gilda Gray. Gray was 7 years younger than B. Palmer. She was a Polish immigrant who had reinvented herself, and crucially, she fit the studio system's preferred, highly marketable aesthetic. She was the quintessential blonde starlet, visually striking, eager for fame, and most importantly, willing to be molded by the men writing the checks. The systematic transfer of power began with a massive, carefully coordinated public relations campaign. The theatrical syndicates threw the colossal weight of their marketing machinery entirely behind Gilda Gray. Overnight, the narrative in the press began to shift. The newspapers and magazines that had once hailed B. Palmer as the revolutionary creator of the shimmy suddenly began to focus their glowing attention on Gray. She was heavily promoted as the new definitive face of the era. The studios branded her the $1 Million Shimmy Queen, a title that deliberately ignored the woman who had actually fought the initial battles against conservative censorship to bring the dance to the public in the first place. This was the architecture of betrayal in its purest form. The industry took the physical rebellion the bee had weaponized against Victorian morality and turned it into a sanitized, mass-produced product. They stripped the shimmy of its raw underground jazz roots and polished it for widespread consumption. As Gilda Gray's star rapidly ascended, propelled by an industry desperate to install a compliant queen, B. Palmer was systematically and quietly marginalized. The spotlight was physically forced away from her, but the theft of her legacy was not limited to the machinations of studio bosses. The nature of the entertainment industry during this era meant that intellectual property, particularly choreography and physical movement, was incredibly difficult to protect legally. Once the shimmy had been unleashed upon the world and its immense profitability proven, other performers ruthlessly jumped onto the bandwagon, eager to claim a piece of the phenomenon for themselves. Performers like the legendary Mae West began to incorporate the shimmy into their own acts, often allowing the press to infer or outright state that they were the originators of the movement. History was being aggressively rewritten in real time, and B. Palmer was forced to watch as her defining creation was fractured and claimed by a dozen different voices, all while the industry that had profited from her initial bravery turned a collective blind eye. The emotional and psychological toll of this widespread theft must have been staggering. To be an artist is to pour the deepest, most vulnerable parts of your soul into your work. To watch that work be stripped from your hands, rebranded, and used to elevate others to the heights of wealth and fame is a unique, soul-crushing form of torment. But the industry was not satisfied with merely stealing her dance. As the decade progressed and the roaring 20s gave way to the harsh, unforgiving realities of the early 1930s, the system moved to strip B. Palmer of her musical legacy as well. B. Palmer was not just a physical performer. She was a deeply intuitive musician and a brilliant creative collaborator. She possessed a profound understanding of phrasing, melody, and emotional resonance. During the late 1920s and early 1930s, she was highly instrumental in the creation and popularization of a song that would go on to become a massive, enduring jazz standard, the heartbreak anthem, "Please Don't Talk About Me When I'm Gone." This song was not just another tune on a sheet of paper. It was a melancholy, deeply emotive piece of music that required a performer capable of conveying profound sorrow and resilience. B. Palmer introduced the song to audiences, pouring her own lived experiences, her own heartbreaks, and the growing sense of her own professional marginalization into every single note. She gave the song its heartbeat. She shaped its delivery, and she was an integral part of its creative inception. However, the music publishing industry of the early 20th century, heavily centered around the notorious Tin Pan Alley, was an exclusive, fiercely patriarchal boys' club. It was a world where women were expected to sing the songs, but the financial mechanics of songwriting, publishing, and copyright registration were almost exclusively controlled by men. When the sheet music for Please Don't Talk About Me When I'm Gone was formally published, and when the official royalties were registered with ASCAP, the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers, a breathtaking injustice occurred. B. Palmer's name was completely erased from the documents. The official credit for the song and the lifelong stream of lucrative royalties that accompanied it were awarded exclusively to two men, the composer Sam H. Stept and the lyricist Sidney Clare. There was no mention of the woman who had helped shape the melody, who had championed the song, and who had delivered it to the public with such devastating authenticity. The industry had once again extracted her creative genius, monetized it, and firmly locked her out of the room where the money was being counted. Imagine the sheer suffocating indignity of that reality. Imagine standing in a recording studio or on a stage, singing a song that was pulled from your own creative spirit, knowing with absolute certainty that every time the record played, every time the sheet music was sold, the financial rewards were flowing into the bank accounts of men who had legally erased your existence. It was a theft not just of credit, but of future security. It was a declaration by the industry that her contributions were entirely disposable. Yet, the most vicious, most crippling betrayal did not come from faceless studio executives or distant music publishers. It came from the very center of her professional inner circle. When an artist is under siege from the broader industry, their manager is supposed to be their vanguard, their fiercest protector, the person who stands between them and the wolves. But for B. Palmer, the wolves were already inside the house. Her manager was a man named Max Hart. For a time, Hart had successfully navigated B through the complex, treacherous waters of the vaudeville and Broadway circuits. He had negotiated her massive contracts during the height of the Shimmy craze and had taken his substantial percentage of her earnings. But a manager in the syndicate era was ultimately loyal to power and capital, not to the artist. As B's relationship with the major studios began to sour, and as the industry aggressively pushed Gilda Gray and others to the forefront, Max Hart calculated the shifting odds. He saw that the syndicate was moving to blackball his client, and instead of fighting for her, he decided to secure his own position by actively participating in her destruction. At the exact moment when B. Palmer was at her most vulnerable, desperately needing strategic guidance to pivot her career and reclaim her narrative, Max Hart turned the full force of the legal system against her. In a ruthless, deeply personal maneuver, Hart filed a severe legal injunction against his own client. The terms of this injunction were designed to completely paralyze her. Hart legally confiscated her stage properties. He locked away her costumes, her custom-written musical arrangements, and the physical tools she required to perform. Furthermore, he utilized his industry connections and the power of the courts to actively block her from booking new tours. He strangled her livelihood. He cut off her oxygen. This was not a mere contractual dispute. It was a professional execution. By blocking her from the stage, Hart was ensuring that she could not generate the income necessary to fight him in court. He was ensuring that she could not remain in the public eye to defend her own legacy. He had effectively trapped the original Shimmy Queen in a legal and financial cage, leaving her entirely at the mercy of an industry that had already decided she was obsolete. The ripple effects of this managerial betrayal were catastrophic. The broader entertainment industry, Watching the internal collapse of B. Palmer's professional infrastructure moved quickly to finish the job. The recording industry, deeply intertwined with the theatrical syndicates, suddenly found her to be entirely untouchable. B, desperate to maintain a connection with her audience and prove her enduring musical relevance, entered the studios of major labels like Victor and Columbia. She laid down numerous test recordings, pouring her voice into the heavy wax cylinders, hoping that the sheer undeniable quality of her vocal performances would force the labels to release them. But the industry had closed ranks. Despite the high quality of the recordings, every single test track she made during this critical period was mysteriously and permanently shelved. The executives locked the master tapes in their dark, temperature-controlled vaults, guaranteeing that they would never see a commercial release. They were silencing her voice, literally and figuratively. They were ensuring that there would be no oral record of her ongoing talent to contradict the narrative that she was a washed-up relic of a forgotten era. To compound this systematic erasure, the cultural narrative surrounding her signature dance was deliberately poisoned. When B first introduced the shimmy, it was controversial, yes, but it was also widely celebrated as a symbol of youthful liberation. But as the 1920s gave way to a more conservative, economically depressed era, the guardians of public morality found a convenient scapegoat. The press, often heavily influenced by the studios looking to distance themselves from their former star, suddenly turned fiercely against her. They began to aggressively label the shimmy as inherently vulgar. They unfairly and maliciously branded B. Palmer with the stigma of a stripper, a devastating label in that era that immediately rendered her entirely unemployable in reputable theaters. Doors that had once been held open for her by fawning producers were now slammed shut in her face. Bookings evaporated into thin air. The system that had eagerly exploited her rebellion, the men who had grown incredibly wealthy off the wild shaking of her shoulders, were now punishing her for the very thing they had begged her to do. Beatrice Palmer found herself utterly boxed in. The architecture of her betrayal was complete. The studios had stolen her dance and handed it to a younger rival. The music publishers had stolen her songwriting credits and handed them to men. Her manager had stolen her ability to work and handed her over to the courts. The record labels had silenced her voice, and the press had destroyed her reputation. The industry had successfully extracted every ounce of commercial value from her genius, and they had engineered a scenario where she had absolutely no avenue for recourse. She was isolated, financially strained, and watching her own history be rewritten by the victors. Yet incredibly, the deepest, most agonizing cuts were still to come. While the industry had dismantled her career with a cold bureaucratic efficiency, the final fatal blows to her spirit would be delivered not by executives in boardrooms, but by the person who knew her most intimately. The professional destruction was absolute, but the intimate treachery that awaited her would shatter whatever remained of her world. The machinery of the entertainment industry is notoriously cold, operating with a bureaucratic cruelty that views human beings as mere line items on a balance sheet. When studio executives, rival performers, or ambitious managers betray an artist, it is a devastating blow, but it is ultimately a business transaction. It is the expected, albeit brutal, nature of the beast. However, the deepest, most crippling wounds are never inflicted in the boardroom. They are inflicted in the quiet, private spaces of a shared life. When the architecture of your professional destruction is drafted by the person who shares your home, your bed, and your creative soul. The betrayal ceases to be business. It becomes a profound psychological trauma from which few artists ever truly recover. For Beatrice Palmer, the original queen of the shimmy, the final and most fatal blow to her career was delivered not by the system she fought against, but by the man she loved and trusted above all others. The roots of this intimate treachery lay in the deeply intertwined nature of her personal and professional life. During the absolute height of her fame in the early 1920s, Bea was married to Al Siegel. Siegel was not a passive observer of her success. He was a highly talented pianist, an esteemed vocal coach, and an ambitious musical arranger. In the vaudeville and Broadway circuits of the era, the relationship between a singer and her accompanist was incredibly intimate. They spent countless hours in rehearsal rooms, dissecting melodies, experimenting with phrasing, and building the unique sonic identity that would captivate an audience. Al Siegel was Bea's primary musical collaborator. He was the man who helped translate the raw, syncopated rhythm she felt in her body into the polished musical arrangements that commanded the stages of the Ziegfeld Midnight Frolic. Together, they were a formidable force. They navigated the treacherous waters of the music industry as a united front. Siegel understood Bea's voice, her rebellious spirit, and her deep connection to the underground jazz scene better than anyone else alive. He knew how to highlight her strengths and how to command the orchestras that backed her. But Al Siegel was also a man who possessed a razor-sharp ability to read the shifting winds of the cultural zeitgeist. He was a survivor in an industry that routinely discarded its idols, and he was constantly scanning the horizon for the next lucrative wave. As the 1920s roared towards their inevitable, catastrophic conclusion, the cultural landscape of America began to undergo a massive seismic shift. The public's insatiable appetite for novelty meant that trends burned bright and fast. The shimmy, the very dance that had catapulted Bea Palmer to unimaginable heights of fame, was beginning to feel like a relic of a bygone era. The frenetic, kicking energy of the Charleston had swept across the nation, capturing the imagination of a new, even more restless generation of youth. The industry, always desperate to sell the next big thing, was actively looking to move past the artists heavily associated with the early 20s. Furthermore, a technological revolution was fundamentally altering the nature of entertainment. The advent of synchronized sound in motion pictures, commonly known as the talkies, was destroying the careers of countless silent film stars and stage performers who could not adapt to the new medium. The entire industry was in a state of chaotic transition. In this highly volatile environment, a performer's relevance was incredibly fragile. Bea Palmer, despite her immense talent and historical significance as a pioneer of jazz, was inextricably linked in the public consciousness to a dance trend that was rapidly passing its expiration date. Al Siegel, ever the calculating observer, saw the writing on the wall. He recognized that his wife's star, once the brightest in the Broadway firmament, was beginning to dim. The studio system was actively marginalizing her. Her former manager had legally paralyzed her touring capabilities, and the press was turning against her. Instead of standing by her side and using his considerable musical talents to help her pivot and reinvent herself for a new era, Siegel made a cold, pragmatic calculation. He decided that tethering his own ambitions to a sinking ship was a poor career move. In 1928, exactly a decade after she had first set New York on fire, Al Siegel filed for divorce. The dissolution of a marriage is always a source of profound grief. But in the glaring, unforgiving spotlight of show business, it is also a public declaration of abandonment. For B. Palmer, the divorce was a devastating emotional blow. The man who had helped build her empire, the man who knew the deepest vulnerabilities behind her fierce stage persona, was walking away precisely when the wolves were gathering at the door. But the mere act of leaving was not the true betrayal. It was what Al Siegel did in the immediate aftermath of the divorce that elevated his actions from a tragic personal failure to a masterclass in psychological cruelty. The ink on their divorce papers was barely dry when Siegel made a swift, highly strategic pivot. He did not retreat from the industry. Instead, he immediately sought out a new vessel for his ambitions. He found his target in a young, entirely unknown woman named Ethel Agnes Zimmerman. She was a former stenographer from Queens who possessed no formal theatrical training, but she had a massive, brassy, undeniable singing voice that could reach the back row of a theater without the aid of a microphone. Siegel took this raw, unpolished talent under his wing. He became her vocal coach, her manager, and her primary creative architect. He poured every single ounce of the industry knowledge, the intricate vocal techniques, and the powerful network of contacts he had meticulously built during his years with B. Palmer directly into this new protege. He introduced her to the right producers, he secured the right auditions, and he taught her how to navigate the very system that had just finished chewing up and spitting out his former wife. He even helped her streamline her name for the marquees, changing it from Zimmerman to Merman. Ethel Merman would go on to become one of the most legendary, enduring, and celebrated stars in the entire history of American musical theater. She was the undisputed queen of the Broadway stage for decades, famous for her iconic performances in shows like Anything Goes and Gypsy. Her rise to absolute theatrical supremacy was directly facilitated by the blueprint Al Siegel had drafted during his marriage to B. Imagine for a moment the sheer suffocating psychological torment of B. Palmer's reality during this period. She was a woman who had been systematically stripped of her signature dance by the studios, robbed of her songwriting credits by the publishing houses, and legally blocked from the stage by her manager. And now, as she sat in the shadows of a rapidly changing city, she was forced to watch her former husband build an absolute empire with a younger woman, utilizing the exact tools, connections, and musical instincts they had developed together. It was not just a replacement, it was a total transfer of her intellectual and social capital. She was forced to witness another woman living the exact life and enjoying the exact protection that she had been brutally denied. Desperate to escape the suffocating narrative of her own obsolescence, B. Palmer made a final valiant attempt to reclaim her relevance and force the industry to acknowledge her enduring talent. As the 1930s dawned and the Great Depression began to cast its long, bleak shadow over the country, the entertainment industry was fully embracing the medium of sound on film. Hollywood was producing lavish, large-scale musical revues designed to distract the public from their economic misery. In 1930, Universal Pictures began production on a massive, highly anticipated cinematic spectacle titled King of Jazz. The film was built around the immensely popular bandleader Paul Whiteman, and it was intended to be a definitive Technicolor celebration of the music that defined the era. Given her undeniable historical status as one of the original pioneers who brought jazz to the mainstream, B. Palmer was hired to perform in the film. For B, this was a critical lifeline. It was an opportunity to immortalize her talent on celluloid, to prove to a massive national audience that her voice and her rhythmic brilliance were not confined to the silent era or the fading memories of the midnight frolic. She stepped onto the soundstage and poured everything she had left into her performance. Historical accounts suggest she filmed a spectacular, highly energetic sequence that perfectly captured the raw, authentic jazz pulse she had championed for over a decade. When the filming was complete, there must have been a flicker of genuine hope. Perhaps this film would be the catalyst for a grand resurgence. Perhaps the sheer undeniable quality of her performance would force the studios to open their doors once again. But the industry was not interested in offering redemption to a pioneer it had already decided to discard. When the final cut of King of Jazz premiered in theaters across the country, Bea Palmer was nowhere to be found. Her entire performance, the sequence she had viewed as her professional lifeboat, had been ruthlessly and entirely left on the cutting room floor. The film, ironically titled A Celebration of Jazz, had systematically erased one of the most vital women who helped build the genre. The symbolism of the cutting room floor is devastatingly precise. It is the ultimate act of editorial violence. It is an industry looking at your work, looking at your face, and deciding that the story they want to tell is better off without your existence in it. For Bea Palmer, it was the final, definitive slamming of the door. The message from the studio system was unequivocal. You are no longer part of the narrative. As the reality of her total professional exile set in, Bea Palmer was forced to confront the most brutal, unforgiving double standard in the entertainment industry: the criminalization of the aging female body. In a capitalist system that values women almost exclusively for their youth, their physical desirability, and their perceived innocence, getting older is not viewed as a natural biological process. It is viewed as a breach of contract. Male stars of the era were allowed to age into distinguished, authoritative roles. Their wrinkles were framed as character. Their gray hair was framed as wisdom. Female stars, however, were afforded no such grace. The moment a female performer began to show the visible signs of a life fully lived, she was deemed expired. She was no longer a marketable commodity. She was a liability. For a woman like Bea Palmer, whose entire identity, immense wealth, and global fame had been inextricably tied to a hyper-physical, highly sexualized dance trend she popularized in her early 20s. The loss of youth was not just a personal vanity issue. It was a total annihilation of her societal worth. When a deeply ingrained system consistently tells a woman that her value is intrinsically tied to her youth and that she is fundamentally worthless without it, the psychological desperation that follows is both inevitable and profoundly tragic. Stripped of her career, abandoned by her creative partners, and erased from the historical record, Bea Palmer desperately sought to anchor herself to the one currency the world still respected. If she could no longer be young herself, she would seek out the validation, the proximity, and the illusion of youth through others. Historical records, though sparse and often heavily obscured by the passage of time, paint a heartbreaking picture of Bea Palmer's personal life as she entered her late 30s and 40s. She began to actively seek out relationships and marriages with men who were drastically younger than she was. These were not mere scandalous Hollywood affairs. They were the desperate actions of a woman trying to prove to a cruel, indifferent world that she was still desirable, still relevant, and still possessed a fraction of the magnetic power she once wielded effortlessly. In 1933, as she approached her 40th birthday, records indicate that Bea Palmer married a man named Jack Fina. Fina was an aspiring pianist, a young man trying to break into the very industry that had just expelled his new wife. He was just 20 years old. The power dynamic of such a relationship is inherently fraught with tragedy. It is the union of a forgotten queen desperately trying to absorb the vitality of a young man, and a young man perhaps blinded by the lingering, fading aura of a former star. Like almost all relationships built on the shifting sands of desperation and unequal standing, the marriage was ultimately doomed to fail, collapsing under the weight of its own impossible expectations. But the pattern had been established. Almost a decade later, in 1942, as the world was once again plunged into the catastrophic darkness of a global war, B. Palmer made another attempt to outrun the ticking clock of her own obsolescence. At the age of 48, long after the public had completely forgotten the name of the original Shimmy Queen, it is widely believed she married a man named Sonny Taubin. Taubin was a soldier, a young man caught up in the machinery of the Second World War. He was 26 years old. These relationships are often dismissed by superficial historical accounts as the erratic, eccentric behavior of a washed-up starlet. But to view them through such a dismissive lens is to completely miss the profound structural injustice that caused them. B. Palmer did not wake up one day and arbitrarily decide to marry men half her age. She was driven to these desperate measures by an entertainment industry and a broader patriarchal society that systematically dismantled her self-worth, stole her life's work, and repeatedly told her that she was entirely disposable the moment she was no longer a young, compliant girl. These marriages were not acts of vanity. They were acts of sheer psychological survival. They were the tragic, agonizing flailing of a woman drowning in the dark, desperately trying to grab onto anything that felt like the light she used to command. By the mid-1930s, the transition was agonizingly complete. Beatrice Palmer, the woman who had single-handedly forced a conservative society to loosen its corsets, the woman who had brought the authentic pulse of underground jazz to the glittering rooftops of New York, the woman who had commanded the highest salary in America, had been thoroughly and efficiently erased. She was no longer a performer. She was not even a cautionary tale, because the industry refused to acknowledge that she had ever truly existed at all. The shimmy was occasionally referenced as a nostalgic trivia question, a quaint fad of the Roaring Twenties, but the name of its brilliant, rebellious creator was never mentioned. The stage lights had been permanently extinguished. The orchestras had packed up their instruments and gone home. The crowds had long since moved on to cheer for the younger, more manageable stars the studio system had manufactured to replace her. B. Palmer was entirely alone. The vibrant, deafening firestorm of her youth had been systematically extinguished, leaving behind nothing but cold, silent ashes. She had survived the vicious theft of her art, the calculated betrayal of her husband, and the ruthless indifference of the cutting room floor. But the most terrifying, most agonizing chapter of her story was only just beginning. Because the true horror of B. Palmer's life was not the speed of her downfall. It was the vast, unfathomable expanse of time she would be forced to endure after the fall was over. The stage was set for a silence that would last for over 4 decades. The true horror of a sudden, brutal fall from grace is not the impact of hitting the ground. The impact, while devastating, is at least an event. It has a definitive beginning and a definitive end. The true horror, the lingering, suffocating nightmare of the discarded pioneer, is the endless, stretching expanse of time that follows the fall, when an icon dies young, at the absolute zenith of their beauty and their fame, Society freezes them in a state of eternal perfection. They are spared the indignity of aging, the cruelty of shifting public tastes, and the quiet agony of irrelevance. They become mythology. But Beatrice Palmer, the original architect of the shimmy, the woman who fundamentally altered the rhythm of American culture, was not granted the mercy of an early curtain call. She was forced to survive her own myth. She was condemned to live out the remainder of her natural life in the vast, silent shadow of a world that had entirely forgotten her name. As the calendar pages turned from the 1930s into the 1940s, and eventually into the booming post-war era of the 1950s, the cultural landscape of the United States transformed beyond all recognition. The frantic, jazz-soaked rebellion of the Roaring Twenties, the era that B. Palmer had personally soundtracked and physically embodied, was relegated to the dusty pages of history books. It was viewed by the new generation as a quaint, slightly ridiculous period of excess, a distant memory belonging to their parents and grandparents. The entertainment industry had evolved into a massive, heavily corporatized machine. Television was rapidly invading living rooms across the nation, creating a brand new pantheon of disposable stars. The theatrical syndicates of Broadway, once the domain of men like Florenz Ziegfeld, were now producing slick, highly polished musical comedies that bore absolutely no resemblance to the raw underground energy B. Palmer had fought so hard to bring to the stage. The psychological weight of this transition upon a woman who had once stood at the very epicenter of the culture must have been unimaginably heavy. Try to place yourself in her position. Try to imagine waking up every single morning in a modest, quiet apartment in New York City, making a cup of coffee, and looking out the window at a metropolis that you used to own. Try to imagine walking down Broadway, passing the very theaters where your name was once written in towering, incandescent lights, only to find yourself jostled and ignored by crowds of people who look right through you. You are a ghost haunting the scenes of your former triumphs. You possess the memories of standing ovations, of the deafening roar of the crowd, of the immense, intoxicating power of holding thousands of people in the palm of your hand. But you have absolutely no one left to share those memories with. The industry had not just taken her money and her dance. It had stolen her context. It had stolen the proof that she had ever mattered. While B. Palmer existed in this state of total suffocating obscurity, the people who had built their empires upon the foundation she laid were thriving in the bright, unforgiving light of the modern era. Her former husband, Al Siegel, had successfully cemented his reputation as a master vocal coach and musical arranger. And Ethel Merman, the young typist Siegel had groomed to replace B, had become an absolute titan of the American theater. During the 1950s, Merman was starring in massive, era-defining hits, her face plastered across billboards, her powerful, brassy voice dominating the radio airwaves. Every time B. Palmer turned the dial on her radio or glanced at the entertainment section of a newspaper, she was confronted with the towering success of the woman who had walked through the doors she had originally forced open. The industry had rewarded the compliant copy and mercilessly buried the rebellious original. Yet, even in the depths of this prolonged silence, the Hollywood machine, with its endless vampiric appetite for compelling narratives, occasionally remembered the existence of the original Shimmy Queen. In the mid-1950s, a time when the studios were experiencing a brief, lucrative wave of nostalgia for the biographies of early 20th century entertainers, there were sudden, tantalizing whispers of a resurrection. In 1954 and again in 1956, prominent producers approached B. Palmer with the prospect of turning her dramatic, turbulent life story into a major motion picture. For a woman who had spent nearly 2 decades in the dark, the arrival of these producers must have felt like a sudden, blinding flash of lightning. It was the promise of ultimate vindication. A biographical film would finally set the historical record straight. It would expose the theft of her dance. It would restore her rightful place in the pantheon of jazz pioneers, and it would introduce her legacy to a massive global audience that had been kept entirely in the dark. One can only imagine the desperate, fragile hope that must have flared to life within her. She likely spent hours recounting her history, digging up old photographs, reliving the triumphs and the excruciating betrayals, offering up her open wounds to the men holding the clipboards, trusting that they would finally tell her truth. But the entertainment industry does not deal in truth. It deals in profitable illusions. As the development of these projects progressed, the studios inevitably ran into a massive, insurmountable problem. To tell the authentic story of Beatrice Palmer, to accurately depict her rise and her brutal fall, would require the studios to indict themselves. It would require them to expose the vicious, exploitative practices of the theatrical syndicates, the systemic theft of intellectual property, and the ruthless marginalization of an independent female artist. The Hollywood establishment, deeply invested in maintaining its own glittering mythology, had absolutely no interest in funding a cinematic confession. And so, with the same cold bureaucratic efficiency that had characterized her initial downfall, the studio executives pulled the plug. The funding evaporated. The producers stopped returning her calls. The projects collapsed before a single frame of film could be shot. The cruelty of this false hope cannot be overstated. It would have been a tragedy for B. Palmer to simply be forgotten, but to be remembered, to be offered the chance of redemption, to have her history excavated and her hopes raised to the heavens, only to have the door slammed in her face one final time, was an act of profound psychological violence. The industry had not just rejected her in her youth, it had returned to mock her in her twilight. It was the definitive confirmation that the system would never, under any circumstances, allow her to reclaim her own narrative. After the collapse of the 1956 film project, the silence that fell over B. Palmer's life was absolute, final, and deafening. As the vibrant, chaotic decade of the 1960s dawned, bringing with it a completely new wave of cultural revolution, civil rights struggles, and musical innovation, Beatrice Palmer was an elderly woman slipping entirely off the radar of humanity. She was living in the dense, unforgiving concrete labyrinth of Manhattan. New York City is a place that demands constant forward momentum. It is a city completely devoid of sentimentality, a place that actively paves over its own history on a daily basis. For an elderly, impoverished woman with no remaining family in the public eye and no connection to the modern entertainment machine, it was a profoundly isolating environment. Stripped of her glamour, her wealth, and her audience, B. Palmer sought connection and purpose in the quiet, overlooked margins of the city. The woman who had once commanded the attention of the wealthiest, most powerful men in America now spent her days navigating the narrow, shadowed alleyways behind the towering apartment buildings. She became a familiar, albeit invisible, fixture in her neighborhood, known to the local residents only as the eccentric elderly woman who meticulously fed the populations of stray cats that roamed the urban landscape. There's a deep, poignant poetry to this final chapter of her life. The stray cats of Manhattan were the discarded, unwanted residents of the city. They survived on the fringes, ignored by the rushing masses, relying on their instincts and the occasional unprompted kindness of strangers. It is not difficult to see why the former Queen of Broadway, a woman who had been systematically discarded by the glittering society she helped build, felt a profound sense of kinship with these forgotten creatures. She poured the remnants of her fiercely nurturing spirit, the energy that had once commanded orchestras, into ensuring that the most vulnerable residents of the alleyways were not completely ignored. However, the harsh reality of urban poverty is entirely devoid of romance. In the mid-1960s, an incident occurred that perfectly, tragically encapsulated the total degradation of her circumstances. While walking through the city streets, likely on her daily route to tend to the stray animals, the elderly Beatrice Palmer fell into an open, poorly secured construction trench. This was not merely an unfortunate accident. It was a deeply humiliating, physically devastating manifestation of her invisibility. The city infrastructure itself had literally swallowed her whole. When she was eventually pulled from the trench, bruised, frightened, and vulnerable, the incident did not spark public outrage. It did not result in a major investigation. It simply warranted a tiny, dismissive, almost mocking blurb in the back pages of a local newspaper. The journalist who wrote the brief paragraph had absolutely no idea that the frail old woman who had tumbled into the dirt was the exact same woman who had once worn diamonds and defined an era. To the press, she was just another nameless casualty of the chaotic metropolis. It was the ultimate heartbreaking proof that her erasure from the public consciousness was complete. The physical toll of the fall, combined with the accumulated weight of decades of stress, poverty, and heartbreak, began to rapidly break down her remaining health. In 1967, the original Shimmy Queen was admitted to a modest, unassuming hospital ward in New York City. She had been diagnosed with cancer, and the disease was progressing with a ruthless, unstoppable velocity. A hospital ward is the great equalizer. It strips away the illusions of wealth, status, and historical significance. In the stark, sterile environment of the medical facility, B. Palmer was not a revolutionary artist, nor was she a forgotten pioneer. She was simply an elderly patient facing the terrifying, solitary reality of her own mortality. There were no reporters camped outside the hospital doors holding vigil. There were no frantic phone calls from studio executives. There were no tearful crowds of fans praying for her recovery. The woman who had spent her youth surrounded by the deafening noise of the roaring 20s spent her final weeks surrounded only by the quiet, rhythmic hum of medical machinery and the hushed voices of the nursing staff. Her family, perhaps out of a desperate desire to protect her remaining dignity, or perhaps as a final bitter reflection of her completely forgotten status, kept her declining condition entirely out of the press. They understood that the world had stopped caring about Beatrice Palmer decades ago, and they chose to shield her final moments from the indifferent gaze of a society that had treated her so callously. Yet, even as the cancer ravaged her system, even as she lay quietly in the modest ward waiting for the inevitable curtain to fall, there was one final piercing detail that emerged from her last days, a detail that serves as a haunting, unforgettable testament to the life she had truly lived. According to accounts from the medical staff who tended to her, the nurses were frequently taken aback when they attended to the elderly patient. Despite the devastating effects of the illness, despite her advanced age, and despite the decades of hardship she had endured, The nurses noted with profound astonishment that Beatrice Palmer still possessed the underlying physical architecture of a dancer. Even in her final fragile state, her musculature retained a distinct, undeniable memory. They whispered amongst themselves that the frail, 73-year-old woman lying in the bed still somehow possessed the core strength and the physical vessel of a much younger woman. It is a devastatingly beautiful, overwhelmingly tragic image. The body never truly forgets. The entertainment industry had stolen her name. The studio syndicates had stolen her choreography. The publishing houses had stolen her music. Her husband had stolen her future. The public had stolen her legacy. But they could not steal the physical truth of what she had done. The body of the dancer had fiercely held onto its strength, preserving the muscle memory of the syncopated rhythms, the underground jazz clubs, and the explosive, world-changing tremor of the shimmy. Her physical form remained a tragic, enduring monument to the very commodity the capitalist machine had so eagerly consumed, so ruthlessly exploited, and so coldly discarded. In the final months of 1967, in a quiet room completely divorced from the glittering lights of Broadway, Beatrice C. Palmer closed her eyes and took her final breath. She was 73 years old. When she passed, there were no state funerals. There were no grand sweeping eulogies printed on the front pages of the New York Times or the Chicago Tribune. The Broadway theaters did not dim their marquee lights in a moment of reverent silence. The orchestras did not pause their performances to play a mournful rendition of "Please Don't Talk About Me When I'm Gone." The passing of the woman who had fundamentally altered the trajectory of American popular culture, the pioneer who had bridged the massive divide between the underground and the mainstream, went entirely unnoticed by the world she had helped to build. The silence was absolute. The erasure was final. The story of Beatrice Palmer is not merely a melancholic biography of a forgotten entertainer. It is a searing indictment of a capitalist machine that treats human genius as a disposable commodity. Her life shatters the comforting illusion of meritocracy, proving that true innovation is often punished by the very system that profits from it. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into a profoundly forgotten chapter of our cultural history. If this story moved you, please hit the like button, share your thoughts on B. Palmer's incredible life in the comments section, and subscribe to our channel so we can continue bringing these vital hidden stories out of the shadows. See you next time